yeah, it can be positive and it can be negative. And we'll start off and we'll just call it imagery, but it doesn't matter, you know, visualization or imagery, but essentially it's forming a construct of whatever you want to do, or without actually doing the thing itself. And we might look at it and just create some terms to start with, and we could look at internal imagery and external imagery. And external imagery would be that imagery that we might have of watching somebody do something, whether it's yourself or an expert. And that external imagery is a great way of actually getting an idea of what something should look like when done by an expert. So really, really useful to do. And internal imagery is done from the perspective of you doing that action yourself, so that skill yourself. So it's almost that feeling from your own eyes. Now, probably the main difference between the two is, one, you're seeing it compared to doing it yourself, but also, of course, when you're doing it yourself with internal imagery, we can use all of our senses. So we can look at how we feel, what we see, what we hear, what our proprioception feels like, you know, that whole mass of the senses. And actually there's a gentleman, the Lang's theory of emotional imagery. So we can also utilize the emotions that might sit with competition or performance to utilize it at the same time. So, and we can all do that. We can sit here now and we can imagine we're riding a motorbike, or we can stand and we can imagine that we're running or moving, or I can watch on TV somebody moving incredibly well or skiing, and then I can try and relate that to my own poor efforts. It works beautifully to support performance. Both do. Probably internal imagery at different stages. So if you're trying to create your own performance, internal imagery is probably when you would do it. So a lot of people may use that prior to actually doing the activity themselves, so almost as a priming activity. The thing to remember with internal imagery in terms of how well it works fantastically at making you do an activity better, but it works even more better at making you do an activity worse, if that makes sense to you. So if you imagine yourself doing something badly, it will absolutely help you do it badly. If you imagine yourself doing something well, it will help you do that well. But it works slightly better if you imagine it badly. So when you use imagery, make sure you use it in a very positive way. Make sure you use it where the performance is good, your movement is good, and you're doing the stuff that you want to.
So kind of almost that self-talk of, I'm going to fall, and then you fall.
Absolutely like that. And it really works well, because of course what you're doing is you're using all the senses. And what we know from some studies, that when you actually image an action and we put EMG markers around the body, we get that ghost trace of what actually happens during the action itself. So you're almost seeing a shadow trace, not at the same intensity, but you're seeing that coordination across the body of how you would perform that action.
I go back to some psychology books I read when I was younger. I think Tim Galway talks about it in both tennis and golf again, kind of that bouncing and then hitting a ball and getting the timing and just watching someone do it and then doing it yourself, or picking a golf ball out of the golf hole, and kind of that's the thing you think about before you take the shot, because that's the thing you want to do next almost. So I guess how would an endurance athlete be able to focus on something like in terms of imagery when it's such a repetitive motion? All three sports in triathlon are one after the other, and it's not as straightforward as thinking about hitting one shot. I know every shot, there's a many shots in a game of tennis, but it's not the same shot.
No, it isn't. But there'd be generalizations that as an endurance athlete you really want, wouldn't you? And I like this idea of a dashboard in endurance sports, where you've probably got 3 or 4 or 5 key elements that you want to be priming. And you might have that image of standing tall so that with high hips, and your image may be, of course, of something pulling you up. So you have that, you know, so you might have that image of a relaxation across the shoulders and wide shoulders. And you may again have a lovely image of that width across your shoulders and something that makes you feel wide and strong and tall with weight off your hips. So you can start to use the emotions that you would feel with that. So you might have an emotion of lightness, if you like, as you do that, lightness off your feet, lightness off your hips, and that imagery of sound perhaps that you like when your foot's striking properly. And you'll know that we can talk about, for instance, in running, of this idea of rhythm, but we also have the idea of tone. And we'll get that difference between slapping and that where you're feeling really light across the sand. And you might, you know, I've had people that have this image of running across water, you know, where they're not touching the surface because they're so light. So we can use stuff that really creates the emotion that we want, that sits with what we want to happen. But we can also use that idea of priming what we want to feel like. So not making it mechanical, but priming the feeling that we want. And of course, we can actually use the image of us running well and seeing ourselves running well. And, you know, you tell me what would the key things be to run nicely, for instance, with an athlete who's just running beautifully?
Well, you've kind of labelled them off there, haven't you? Your work with track and field athletes is shining through. But yeah, exactly as you said, you know, thinking about good posture, thinking about what your hips are doing, maybe thinking about your foot strike in terms of what it feels like or where it is. But I like the ones tall and proud, or maybe sometimes, you know, thinking about driving with the knee, just because it helps. As people get tired, their knees usually just drop a little bit and they slump down a bit. So those sort of couple of ones work.
And having the strength of those pictures or that whole emotional set becomes very, very important. And particularly, I think, as you rightly said, as we fatigue, if we're not careful, we can get into that double whammy, whereas we get physiologically fatigued and also we lose that quality of movement. So we can get that double decrease in performance, if you like. And actually, one of our cues may be, as we fatigue, we go into that imagery of what we know underpins good style, good poise, good posture in our movement. And we might go through that dashboard of just 3 or 4 checks that actually underpin the movement as well, rather than just doing the movement. What primes what we want to happening, and using our imagery in that way.
I think also it's useful to use coaches or supporters in that style rather than the classic go harder, keep going and everything else. In endurance sports, well, probably the athletes signed up because they can keep going and that's what one of their strengths are. You know, they're able to keep on going, but actually just a reminder on a technical cue, especially say in a run, or you might catch them on the bike, but obviously people are screwed in a bit more there in terms of the position is fixed. But for running, you know, just giving them a cue is far more effective usually than telling them to run faster, because in reality they're going as hard as they can probably already.
Well,
and they know that.
Absolutely. And you've got, it's great to tell someone to run faster, but actually sometimes we need to know what to do. And again, we need to know what cues what we do, so we're not making it a mechanical sort of robotic movement. And again, if we think about this is stuff that we practice. If actually we're coming back to thoughts that are really useful to us when life is tough, and those are our images that we're creating that underpin good movement, you know, we can build that in right from the very beginning of our training. And we can build the quality, of course, of that imagery as we go through that and get better and better at completing the skill, so that then as we fatigue, our automatic thoughts, and again, we think about it, if we're fatigued and we're feeling crap, don't be surprised if our thoughts take us to, I don't really want to be doing this. Why am I doing this? Actually, to have that route that says, I've trained myself to take myself into things that are going to maintain my performance at the highest level I can. That's really good training, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And that's imagery in its own right.
It is. And it takes us into another area, actually. I've noticed, I don't know what research there is, but as I've worked with athletes who are coming back from injury and we start to use imagery, and quite often in the past I've said, oh, you know, can you image yourself running or moving? And they will tell me that actually they can't create the imagery of it almost until they can do the movement. So we can almost start to use where they can go with their imagery as to where they can get to when they're actually performing the movement. And I think we can use them to leapfrog ahead of each other. You know, you're nearly ready, you can start to get the imagery. Okay, we can just move the rehab a little bit further. Okay, we start to move the rehab with the imagery changes a little bit. And it can be both a really good protective force, you know, because it means that we don't put people into stuff that they're just not ready to do because they can't create that image. But sometimes we sometimes also do have to just slightly put the cart before the horse to tell your brain that you are ready to do this. But if you think about it, what we're doing is we're putting a system in place where we can move people forward, but we're keeping the risks very, very low, which is a really nice way of doing it. And it's a great way of creating confidence as well. You know, in essence, again, in skill learning, I quite often find that people can start to image. When someone can image a movement, they can suddenly do it. And of course, if you think about it, that makes sense, because what you're doing, as we've talked about with internal imagery, is you're sending that sequence of nervous responses around your body, which is telling your muscles what to do, in the sequence that you want them to do it during the actual movement. So it's almost saying, of course I can do it because I can send those sequences. So now don't be surprised if I really can do a backflip, because I can do it in my, but if you can't image that backflip, don't be surprised if you lose where you are when you're upside down.
Yeah.
You know.
And I guess there's also some interesting points there around why coaches break things down into drills. You know, you sit there and you do a drill. I remember I was on a coaching course once, and they were saying, right, you're going to practice getting onto your bike. And one of the drills was a flying squirrel. So you're running along and then you literally just jump onto your bike. And I remember the other coach at the time who was doing the course, they were just like, right, okay, so all you're going to do is just run along and you're going to jump on your bike. And I was sort of sat there, that wasn't my method of getting onto the bike. And I was sat there going, well, how? How can I do that? And they said, well, go off and work it out on your own, sort of thing. So, I mean, I probably put my hands up and say it wasn't the world's best coaching that I've seen at that moment in time. But it really taught me as another coach as well, actually, okay, that's the outcome you want, and that's the starting point. So where are those stepping points to get to there? What do you need to do to be able to do that, and how to break down a skill? And that's fundamental in terms of coaching or learning new skills. And I guess people do that without realizing they're going through those motions with a coach or anyone, from a tennis, hitting a tennis shot or a hockey shot or something like that, which is quite impactful to anything more repetitive like running or swimming.
It is. And I think we often forget, by the way, in running or swimming, that they're high skill sports. It's just that we're repeating those sports so often. But of course, if you're doing each step or each stroke with very high skill and putting that power through technique, that's going to determine how effective you're going to be. And just because you repeat it so many times doesn't mean it's not high skill. It doesn't mean it, doing it with that beautiful quality isn't important. And it's one of the things I notice when we go up the levels is just how beautifully super high quality performers move, whether they're running or whether they're hitting a tennis ball or a golf ball. The beauty of the movement is inherent, and I think that can get forgotten about, and people go to training the physiology, and quite often the biggest gains can be made in that quality of movement. And I think imagery is a really huge tool, and I think you've described it. We go from drills into the quality of the movement, which then takes us into the process of what we're actually doing, and they become lovely stepping stones into the actual skill and performance itself. And by breaking it down like that, it allows us to move backwards and forwards through those routes. So if actually a skill does start to break down, for instance, we don't have to go back to the beginning. We can move up and down that ladder, if you like. And imagery is a really good way of tying it together. It's also a really good way of getting free practice without having to get that level of fatigue. So, if you want to hone a skill, make sure you're using imagery. And I would look at it, and again, I'll take it to another sport because it's just easier to describe. But if we have a golfer who goes to a range and hits 100 shots, and we can make an example. He hits 100 shots, and we could say 60 of those are okay, 20 are great, and 20 are poor. How do we then make sure that actually he takes advantage of the 20 good ones rather than the 80 that are okay or poor? And we can obviously, you know, if we think about that, and you hit a shot, okay, that was a good shot. Okay, what do we then do? We image what you did in that shot. What do we then do before we hit the next shot? Okay, we image that again, which hopefully primes what we want to happen. So for every good shot, we can get 3 or more practices from it. So because the danger is otherwise is you hit 100 shots, 60 are okay, 20 are great, 20 are poor. Actually, what we do is we get the average of all of those that we put into our system. And of course, when we practice, what we want to do is shift how good we're getting. So we want to take advantage of the stuff that we've done that is good. And so actually we can use imagery to make sure we're not only making the chance of the next time we do it be better, but we're effectively teaching our body what those good things felt like, which of course then goes into memory. And all we're really doing when we repeat a skill is we're pulling that schema of what that looks like back. And great athletes, of course, pull that schema back beautifully under pressure. You know, and imagery is a wonderful tool to help us do that. And again, as a coach, it would be something you would automatically, I suspect, be putting in. But you can see, prime it. That felt good. What did it feel like? Rehearse it again. Use it. You know, it didn't feel good. Okay, well, throw it away. You know, because we're trying to get quality into our systems, aren't we?